I'm also kind of averse to like disappointing someone or standing my ground in some ways. And in a sales context, that takes on that takes on a lot. It sort of wears different clothes. It's like that can be around price, that can be around what service you provide, that can be around, being asked a question and having to figure out like, oh, we don't do that. We don't provide that. So like, how do I...
Welcome to the Raw and Real podcast. Are you dreaming of changing your life through opening a business? Or are you curious what obstacles entrepreneurs had to overcome on their journey? Then you're in the right place. My name is Agnes Bilik and I'm your host. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Raw and Real. Thanks for joining us today. I have with me Cody Reid-Dodick. He's from New York and he owns a coffee shop in Amsterdam called Good Beans with the brand Fucking Strong Coffee. Hey Cody, thanks for joining me today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, can you tell us how did you end up owning a coffee shop where you actually drink coffee in Amsterdam?
Yeah, the other kind of coffee shop would probably be a bit more relaxing, but it's an interesting story. It's a bit of a winding story, but I'll try to distill it as well as I can. So I came to Amsterdam about a little over 2 years ago to do my master's in English literature. My line is always that I say I came to do my master's mostly in being abroad. So I was looking to explore being in Europe, live in a different context. I'd gone to school in Washington, D.C. My family lives in New York City. And so I felt like there was a lot of comfort at home, but I was looking for more of a challenge. So I came to do my master's at the University of Amsterdam.
And why Amsterdam, actually?
So I wish I could say I had a more intention behind it. It was a bit more about kind of exploration. And then I'd grown up, most of my childhood I spent actually in the UK. So I was looking to, when I was looking at coming to Europe, I was steering away from the UK because I had more experience with it. And then after that, there aren't tons of really interesting, engaging cities that are English speaking and have good English programs. So yeah, so it was a bit of I kind of backed into it, but ended up being a really lovely program. I finished it last year. But about maybe 4 months into my classes, I was realizing that my social life wasn't as vibrant as I thought it was going to be. I was living alone, and I was finding it hard to not only meet people and actually, make friends, but more, I wasn't feeling as engaged with the city. A lot of my experiences with the city were sort of more personal. I was getting out and about, but I didn't feel like I was sort of a part of the fabric of Amsterdam, which I think at least is a kind of a fantasy in your mind of when you try to integrate into a city.
Yeah, definitely, because I think so many internationals are also here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, you, at least for me, I also had a pretty acute kind of insecurity as I was coming abroad. And I think it's probably accentuated by being in a place with a lot of internationals, a lot of expats, because you see the experience around you, of knowing that, you're always going to be coming from a sort of outsider perspective. You're not Dutch, you're not from Amsterdam. And I think you have to be really intentional and thoughtful about how you integrate, what you can offer to the city, what parts of the city you can respect, and how you can learn, how you can be open-minded. And I think, especially being a student early on, I found that although that was a great way to like give me access to groups of people and networks and feel like I was in a learning environment, it's not very conducive to actually integrating into Amsterdam or whatever city you're in, because you're kind of in this kind of somewhat artificial sub network or sub community, and so you end up not really becoming a part of your neighborhood, getting to know your neighbors, getting to know shopkeepers around and things like that. And I think you have to build in sort of an intentional process to do it. I don't know if you would agree with that experience, but I think I think that's something I realized kind of early on. And so
I think the point about it is that it really takes time.
Mm-hmm.
You need to invest the time, and at some point it just comes naturally.
Yeah. Time and also kind of thought. Like I think that there's a lot of ways. Like I think there's a lot of expats in Amsterdam who give it a kind of shallow thought. Think like, well, what does feeling at home mean to me? And then let's create that. Which is, I think, a bit of a backwards way of looking at integrating into a city. To me, it's more like what is home to other people here? What does the city give me? And because the idea that I'm going to come here and with my own sort of preconceived notions of what home will feel like for me, and then create it is, I think, a fallacy, right? Like you have to take it from the place if you're going to consider a place home.
Yeah, totally. I think you have to adapt to the culture if you choose to live here.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was a roundabout way of saying basically I was bored and feeling not at home when about 3 or 4 months into my being a student here. And so I was kind of wandering around with the vague idea that I'd like to work for cash or even volunteer, do something that just made me like sort of acquainted myself with a different part of the city, got me out of the classroom, gave me something to do, honestly, filled some hours. I'd come from this very sort of social, really, intensely busy time when I was in university in DC. And then suddenly, even though I was still going to school, just a completely different, 180 turn in terms of just how I organized my time and how much free time I had and how much alone time I had. And so, so that sort of vague curiosity in filling my hours ended up changing my young life pretty significantly. So I wandered into a little space just off the Haarlemmerstraat in Amsterdam, which is it's turned out to be a very, very fascinating spot. It's where eventually we have our shop. But it's kind of a little alleyway off of a bigger street just outside of the center of Amsterdam. A street that is kind of a really interesting mix, as well as an area that's an interesting mix of tourism, kind of a bustle of visitors and expats and a real high street feel. And then also like a really, really local kind of old school Amsterdam, Jordan vibe. And then I think it's also emblematic of a kind of changing Amsterdam. So there's quite a lot of money in certain areas near certain streets near it. And quite cool shops, trendy things like that. So I wandered into this little shop, and at that time it was called Good Beans. We actually inherited the name. We decided to take on the name of this little tiny shop.
So you just wandered there by coincidence?
Yeah, I think the first time I stumbled upon it was actually with my sister. She was visiting, so that would have been in October. So 3 months into my time here. And I want to say she actually wandered in first. So all the riches that I make from this, I'll give directly to her. But so I think we just walked in, and I remember thinking like, wow, this is such a cute little space, but what in the world is this? Is this basically? They had a little kind of shitty coffee machine in the corner. It was a lot of coffee beans, and then there was a rack of clothes, and there was this two big antique items that took up about 50% of the shop. And and I remember just being like, I like the feel here. I don't really know what it is. And asked the guy who was working there, are you guys looking for any help? Do whatever. And I'll say that moment was kind of the start of a lot of serendipity in the whole experience, because he really immediately, it was almost as if he was waiting for someone to ask the question, because immediately he said, I actually am leaving. I'm going to work on some project away from Amsterdam. I'm going to leave in January, maybe a bit before. And, it's just me and the owner needs a lot of help, running the shop, helping with things. And so we absolutely are looking for something. Come in on Saturday and speak to the owner.
So how was the shop doing back then?
Not well at all. Actually, it's interesting to have. Sometimes I think like, wow, it's a kind of muddy origin story. Sometimes I think like, oh, I wish it was easier to describe to people, but it's a really, really kind of rewarding experience to have as well, because it's so fascinating to go. We're having this conversation a few feet away from where Good Beans is now, and to the idea that like we could probably walk over there and have 6 regulars sitting in there and chatting and taking part in this community. That is the utter opposite of what it was then. No regular customers, nobody was there. I mean, I would spend hours by myself in the shop, and so it was not making much money at all.
So how did you end up owning it?
Yeah, so basically, part of the way through that kind of part-time working experience, I met a guy named Harold, who's my co-owner now, and he started coming in. He was almost like one of the first people that actually started sitting down. We had one chair, and so he would sit in the chair, and we started chatting more. I actually pretty vividly remember our first few conversations, just mostly personal stuff about me, where he was, and I often say we're not only very, very different personalities and sort of different styles of interacting and working, etc. But also, we were in very, very different stages of life. So I was, working on a master's, young, exploring a new city for the first time, and Harold was, in his mid to late 30s, and he had basically had a pretty successful career as a marketer, and was just utterly fed up with corporate life. Like couldn't have seeped more into his bones, and he couldn't have hated it more. Basically, he didn't. I think he disliked the sort of surface level relationships that were made at work. Although he is now living with a girlfriend that he met at work, so I guess they're not all surface level. But he hated the sort of surface level relationships, the faux socializing, the having meetings just to have meetings, and stuff that he would describe as just sort of bullshit.
So he was looking for a way out.
Totally, yeah. And he still needs to make money, and still, wanted to make money in some way. It wasn't like he was going to go retire, but he, had been able to have an apartment in Oslo and whatever. So he was relatively comfortable, was in an experimental phase in his life. And so this weird Norwegian and this chatty American ships passed in the night, and somehow, luckily, someone called out on the decks. And so we started chatting more. And then at that point, we kind of had like a three-headed kind of like structure with the original owner, Harold, and me. And then we brought on a guy who's like an investor as well. It's kind of like I call him a silent partner now, although he's very helpful in a lot of ways. But so we had this kind of odd, I would call it a 6 months period where we were sort of sorting things out. So figuring out, does this thing have any potential? Do we want to do it? Cody, do you actually want to put any effort and time and maybe money into this thing? Because, you're still a master's student. Are you going to stay in Amsterdam, etc.? So the original owner, is this something that you want to do? Whatever.
What were your thoughts then in your head? I mean, there must have been such a huge moment.
So at that point, I've now been able to kind of crystallize it more. But I think at that point, especially because I was working on my thesis in conjunction with this, and I felt very much sort of like swimming downstream. And also I didn't bring much intention into like future planning. So there was very little like strategic thinking. There was little kind of vision at all. Like this was all something that had kind of happened to me, right? It was imagine a kind of part-time job at this weird shop that then suddenly starts tumbling into like, more and more serious conversations. So even though I've been able to kind of look back and have hindsight now, it still was a real blur. I still don't have much of a way of describing, how it all kind of came together. So it was kind of little bit by bit, right? So we figured out an initial ownership structure. That was the first time that I got, an official sort of stake in the company just based on work that I'd done. I didn't put any money into it. And then we kind of were like, hey, let's try to be open more. Let's think about changing some products. And that was my first dip into like, okay, like now I can actually start to shape a little bit of what we do. But this is still stage 0.1 of what Good Beans became.
So just based on your engagement, you got a stake in the company?
Yeah. So I basically kind of had helped this guy out. He didn't have any employees. We had found each other at the right time too. As I explained, I was in this kind of odd place where I was like, I'll go as long as I can meet, more than the 0 people I meet a day now, I'll go sit anywhere. And if I can get free coffee as well, like whatever. So I was kind of like not working for much money, not expecting anything too official or formal. And so that really helped him out at the time. And he was a very lovely, generous guy. And so he, felt like it was important that I had some sort of stake and was paid back in some way. And so that was the first step. And then, kind of a series of events over last summer, so a little over a year ago, which restructured everything. And basically, we changed to having a kind of a 3-parted ownership structure. And so that original owner, he left. He kind of wanted more structured. He had just had a kid. So we bought him out, and then it became kind of 3 of us, with Harold and I being the kind of operators at that point. So running the shop, and then working on the brand with the help of our third partner. And so, so that was in, let's say, August and September, when all of that came together. And so suddenly now, after this kind of all this weird reordering, like that's where we were about a year ago.
So what were your challenges when you took over the shop?
So I think I always describe it as kind of this oddly contradictory experience where it was really, there were a lot of real benefits of taking over a space, right? Because, you don't have to expend any energy on the sort of nuts and bolts of starting something, right? So whether it's literally, building out a space, or it's figuring out a loan, finding a space, etc., all of that stuff was taken care of. So we were given this spot. There were elements to it that we absolutely loved that we would never have wanted to change. So, our counter is still our counter. It's this old, beautiful antique counter. At the tail end of the sort of mix of random ownership and stuff, we had bought a really nice espresso machine. We started a lease on a really nice espresso machine, so we had that in place. But yeah, when it became sort of mine, when I was fully a co-owner, we had no fridge, we had no sink, we had still no furniture, basically nowhere to sit, anything. So it started an interesting process all of last fall of like, what do we really want to make this space? So like I said, you have some of the ease of actually taking over a spot and not having to do everything from scratch. But then you also have the challenge of like, well, I've already been in this space for 6 months. And so I've developed patterns in how I use it. I've developed patterns in how I see it. And it's really hard once those are kind of hardwired, it's really hard actually to step back and see something anew. I probably underestimated how difficult it was to be like, okay, now think of a vision for it, because it's not new, it's not a blank canvas. It's more of a restructuring than anything.
Yeah, because you were already in the old concept, so it's kind of harder to take this step back, I guess.
Exactly. So yes, so I think it took a lot more thought than I think we realized. So the main objectives, I would say, in my idea in terms of designing the space, and that was mostly my responsibility, was designing a new space, making it a cafe. Was let's figure out a way that we can get furniture in. Let's figure out a way that we can create an environment that kind of fits our developing brand as well. And to me, in the early days, that was a lot about like, let's create a sort of coziness, a comfort in this space, because it's unconventional. It's super small. It doesn't have the markings of a normal cafe. So I think I was noticing a lot of people interact in a sort of uncomfortable way with it. When I spent my first 6 months there, where people just were unsure what this was. Why is there no furniture? Why do I feel like this is very cool, but also I have no fucking clue where I am? And so I think I was really on a mission to like create comfort in a place that had kind of made a lot of people confused. And so, so it was like, how do you make a comfortable space? And then what really became a goal, and I think has really shaped who we've become as a cafe and also as a brand, is how do you create interaction? So pretty early on, I decided I don't think we want tables, or tables like as in tables that you could sit at 2 to 2. I didn't want to create too much kind of. I didn't want to build too much partitioning into the space itself. I wanted to make it somewhere that people could interact. And so what it became was basically kind of a big circle. So our goal was to make a living room, and that was the idea. It was like living rooms are set up to, they're not spliced into 3 different parts where people interact. So the kids don't have their 2 couches facing each other, and the parents have their 2, seats over there, and then there's a TV that you go into. It's a free flowing, open kind of circular space, and that's what Good Beans became. So in October we sold our massive cabinet that took up half the space. We ripped down the wall. We took out all the electric stuff. We put in a new sink. We repainted all the walls. And then I went and did a big, with a little bit of money that we got for the cabinet, I went and bought all of our furniture, super budget. And suddenly we kind of had created something out of, something very, very different in this new space, while still, I think, keeping a lot of what I really admired about it beforehand.
And you're like super young, you're 23 and you're owning this coffee shop and you have to do a lot of business meetings, I guess. So how do you experience them? Like, what are your internal struggles in the business setting?
Yeah, it's a very pertinent question. Actually, we after a year, we've really have a great kind of foundation both in the shop and for the brand. So we have these kind of we have a lot of more sturdy footing under us in terms of we have much more of a regular business. We're making a lot more money in the shop, much more consistent revenue. We have a web shop now. We've gone through all these exercises that I just spoke about in terms of branding and brand story and values, etc. And so now we've made a pivot to moving more into wholesale, moving more into kind of sales in general, figuring out where we want to bring the brand in other directions. And that's really exciting. It gets me out of making coffee all the time and makes me, exercises new muscles, makes me develop, which is really good personally. But it brings up, probably my deepest insecurity with this, which is that I'm super young and I don't have much experience in the industry, and I also don't have experience as an entrepreneur. And so, and I think also those two things, I filter them through this perspective of being young because I am young, but those two things can also be the case if you're 38 years old or if you're 28 or if you're 48. Like the newness to me is, it's defined by my age, but actually I don't think that's the only reason I feel these feelings. In general, it's kind of a feeling of being either out of place or a bit of like an imposter complex. Like, why do I deserve to be here? What, which I think a lot of people can identify with, especially entrepreneurs. And so, so it's a really pertinent question. And I think, I'll kind of dive into the insecurity first, and then we can work through the ways of getting over it. Maybe you can give me some tips.
That sounds good.
But I think the insecurities are one, being young. I think like you can always be sort of beyond your years, and you always hear people talk about like, oh, that person is mature and whatever. And I do think I'm mature. I think I've been lucky to have like a lot of different experiences in my life. I think that, I've been able to interact with a lot of people, learn from people. I have great relationships with mentors, and that's been a real benefit. So I think that I do think, let's like, to use a colloquialism, I'm beyond my years in some ways. But at the end of the day, like, I think there's this feeling of just like, I have no business talking to some of these people, whether it's a company of 100 people where, I'm talking to an office manager or a connection that might be, the CEO of it or whatever, or, you're chatting to a shop owner who has a really, really cool concept for a shop, who seems to have it all figured out and, is a super cool woman or man. And you just feel this kind of like, what do I know feeling? And it comes back to, like, where have I been? Why do I deserve to be having this conversation? That's one insecurity. The other insecurity also is pure inexperience. I think that like these things, having these conversations, selling, figuring out the balance between, especially in a kind of service, I still think of our B2B and our wholesale as it's essentially, it has elements of a service business as well, right? Because we might be entering into contracts where we service machines, where we have long-term relationships, right? It's not just a commodity. So in a service context as well, it's like, how do you balance over-promising versus being realistic? How do you balance, bending over backwards and trying to nail this deal with, we have some pretty tight margins and we don't make a ton of money. We don't have a lot of cash in the bank. And so, a lot of it I think is also just like, I actually don't have this experience. And so I think you can pretty, as confident as I consider myself at times, it doesn't take a lot to be like, well, you've never really done this before. So, so like get off your high horse. And then that parlays into like the third insecurity, which is that, because I'm told a lot, like, wow, you're so young doing this. Like, that's cool. You're so young, like whatever. And it's like, I have other friends who make more money than I do, but they're, in entry level positions, and they actually, all they do all day is react to authority, and they don't really have any authority in a traditional sense. Right. And that's what I would be doing if I was back in New York or something, probably. And so I think that there's also this feeling of like, wait, I feel really insecure in these, and feel very young, but then I also have this weird, like almost sense of self-importance. Like I have authority. I have these like 2 employees that work at a shop with me. I have this business partner who's way more experienced at 38, but we're counterparts. I sit in these meetings with our silent partner who has a big job at booking.com. And, I have this, I'm like, there's this feeling of like, shit, am I kind of full of it? Like, am I sort of like inflating myself too much just because I have these interactions? And yeah, it's like, and then suddenly you have this flip side of the problem, right? Where you're like, oh geez, now the problem's not my insecurity, it's my self-importance or my, and then that I think can feed the other one, right? And it's this sort of interesting pendulum swing. And that's like a real challenge I think that I have all the time is like, what's the balance between, I don't like this term, but staying humble, staying aware of like my limitations, my inexperience, whatever. And then also, blazing past it, because I am in these contexts. I do have to go out and sell. I do have to grow this business. And, it's a really hard balance. And I don't even know. I often think like maybe it's actually the pendulum swing. It's just a matter of kind of slowing it and being in control of it as opposed to ever actually really stopping that pendulum. Yeah, that's how I would describe it.
And do you have the feeling that people treat you somehow differently because you're younger in meetings and how they interact with you?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's like I have this odd, like several relationships, and whether it's even just like with customers in the shop or whatever, where I kind of subconsciously, but also not that subconsciously, don't say my age. And even I have a birthday coming up, and it was like a real consideration of like, how much do I want to celebrate? How openly do I want to celebrate this birthday? Do I want to have a party? Do I want to whatever? Because like, shit, when I think about it, a lot of these people do not know my age. And at times when people like hear it or, hear it, they're like, whoa. And I feel like, naturally it changes your perspective sometimes on a person.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And I think that, so I think that, at times I find myself sort of hiding it in ways. I can't say I've ever had, I can't say I've ever been in a meeting and I say, oh, well, I'm 23. And then the whole color of the conversation changes. No. But I do think that I think it's also a worry of like the perception of other people, not in the sense that like, oh, maybe I might be not as competent or not as experienced or whatever, but more I think also there's connotations with like, well, how did this happen? Like, like, I don't get it. Like, I'm, and that's whether you're another roaster in the industry or you're a, whatever, a shop owner or a business owner or a business, whatever. And it's like, I think that there's like a bit of an insecurity where I'm like, what are people like assuming about this? Like, what, like, are people just confused all the time about whatever? And then, so I think it's a concern that it changes conversation, that it changes the tone of things. And I think it maybe it doesn't, maybe it's had less of an effect on other people's interactions with me. So that's the kind of problem you're asking about. And it's interesting. Maybe it's had a less of an effect on that and more of an effect on how I interact with people. And even whether it's my, discomfort with disclosing my age early on or my kind of like shadily avoiding talking about it or talking about when I was in college, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's definitely a dynamic.
So you do have the feeling that you start acting differently when you tell your age as well?
Or when I'm having conversations around it. And that's, I mean, I don't know if you knew this, but age is a pretty integral part of who you are. And so, no, you talk about background, you talk about what you've done before, whatever. And, at 23, what I've done is gone to college and then gone my master's. Right?
Not so much. Yeah.
So there's this, it's not that hard to avoid the topic. And, and I think I find myself doing it. And I have to think about why. Yeah.
So when these feelings come up, how do you cope with that? Like, how do you get over your insecurities?
Yeah, I think there's different strategies, and I'm still figuring it out. The insecurities still exist, but even though I talked about trying not to be self-important, whatever, part of it is I'll describe it as a two-parter process. Part one being take a little bit of like a fuck you attitude, right? Like take a bit of a like brazen, look, I'm either competent or I'm not. I know I'm confident that I have the skills, confident that, I've had enough interactions and experiences and read enough and blah, blah, blah to do a good job in whatever this context is. So you know what, fuck whoever, whoever this is who might be, who might think that I'm too young for it. But importantly, and talking about this pendulum swing, then step two being like, but modulate that, right? Like not just be a bull in a china shop and, I'm a youngster and, who cares? Like I'm just going to kind of, my whole persona is going to be this like young bulldozer. Because that's not who I am. I'm much more of a sort of like communicator. I'm a talker. I pride myself on being super nice and being sort of conflict averse, making people feel comfortable, whatever. And so I don't have this natural ability to just be like, fuck you, I don't care what age I am. So it's like, it's have those feelings so that you can kind of get over the insecurity a little bit, and then modulate and then figure out, okay, well, look, I'm not just an asshole. But it's like, but I belong here. Like I can be here. And you know what? If the answer is that I can't, then I have to prove it to myself that I can, right? I have to just fail then. And it's better to like do it and fail than not to do it at all. I'm speaking sort of unspecifically right now, but like do it being a meeting or a interaction or a sales pitch or a, whatever context it is.
You mentioned that you're conflict averse. So how does that affect you in your meetings and maybe also your dynamic with your co-founder?
Yeah, I think it's also a real challenge. I'll go to the first time kind of with sales again. As I enter this, I'm noticing for the first time, like sales brings you into, I think of conflict or being conflict averse as in a pretty narrow way, right? Where, in whatever situation you have a one-on-one interaction and it's a conflict, you have disagreement or something. And I don't like that. So I don't like to, if I have a roommate doing something that pisses me off, it makes me feel uncomfortable. And it's like, fuck, I don't want to have a hard conversation, So
you don't want to confront it, and
I'm just sort of conflict averse classic, right? Like I don't think it's tied to anything. I think it's just like some people are and some people aren't, and I am. Well, it's not that it's divorced from anything else, but I am conflict averse, and so in a sales context, like as I'm trying to meet more people and try to get into companies, I'm realizing that like, oh, it's not just like when there's a disagreement or when there's an issue. Like I'm also kind of averse to like disappointing someone or standing my ground in some ways. And in a sales context, that takes on that takes on a lot. It sort of wears different clothes, if you will. It's like that can be around price, that can be around what service you provide, that can be around, being asked a question and having to figure out like, oh, we don't do that. We don't provide that. So like, how do I, and whatever. And so I'm realizing like, oh shit, like it's not just being averse to this kind of traditional sense of conflict, but it's also being averse to, disappointing people, to giving hard news, to, having to say like, we can't go any lower on this price, having to negotiate, etc. And that's a challenge. That's definitely a challenge. I think it's something that if I had to develop in one significant way, it would be, to bring sort of more, be a little bit less hyper attuned to like the reaction of people and disappointing people and kind of, again, creating conflict in this sort of different senses that I've discovered over the last little bit.
What's going on in your head? Like, what are your thoughts in these moments?
I think a lot of it is, I think my, there's this sort of cliche that, your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. I don't know if you can ever speak in such sort of black and white terms, but I feel like I sort of fit into that. So I think my greatest strength is like, I'm really good at kind of like, I'm good at connecting with people. I'm good at kind of being pretty empathetic, recognizing how people are interacting with situations, and, whether it's making people laugh or listening to people's stories or bringing up information that they've told me in the past and connecting with them in those ways. I'm good at that. And that's like what's helped me get to positions I have been in my life, whether, with activities I did in school or with this business or whatever, in the shop as well. And so that's like a real strength, what I pride myself on. And I also think it's something that will really serve me well as an entrepreneur too, because I think like if I've learned anything in the last year, it's like I've, you're constantly making connections as an entrepreneur, right? Like whether it's with potential clients or, trying to create a network or customers or whatever, like you're always trying to create connections and to be good at that is really important. And I think it serves me well. But I also think a huge part of that is like, I think a lot about what people think of me, right? I want to be likable. I want people to, like me. I just want them to like feel good about our interaction. And the fact is that like, I'm not going to have like 100% of people that I interact with in my life will not feel good about the interaction with me. I can try to get it close, but it's not going to happen. So like,
yeah,
I should actually use that marginal proportion that exists or percentage that exists. And maybe it's not as marginal as I think I am, but I think it is. But, I should use it strategically, right? I should use it to be, to stand up in the right positions, to not be overly flexible on a deal, to walk away from the table on certain things, or to, stand up for an opinion that I think whatever is important. And I think that, that is what's going on in my mind mostly, is like, I think that when you're in a sales meeting or when you're interacting with a customer or client, likability is so important. And you pair that with my own personal feeling that likability is so important to people. I want people to like me. It's hard to then, it can make you less likely to stand up or to be, more brash or have a disagreement with someone or disappoint someone or whatever. And I think that's what's going through my mind mostly.
Yeah, I can imagine that you're struggling a lot with that, especially in the sales context.
Yeah. No, totally.
And can you tell me a little bit about the failures that you experienced along your way?
Yeah.
Maybe like something that comes up and a learning that you took away from that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have any like, we spent $8 million on this and then it, caught fire overnight or anything like that, luckily, yet, knock on wood. But I think there's been a lot of like micro failures. So like some of that, I think having a physical space, it acquaints you very much with, what I guess what we'll term micro failures in the context of this conversation. So like, you can feel like a real failure when you sit on a cold winter's day and have 2 customers come in the last 3 hours of being open, right? Like, and that was stuff that happened like a lot when we were starting out because people didn't know about us. We weren't part of the neighborhood. We weren't, on any lists. We were a new cafe. But you can, be having a physical space. It's more than just, going to an office and being like, oh, we didn't sell anything today, because you're still working. You're kind of, you're in the machine. You're trying to tweak it. You're trying to get it right. But sitting behind a counter and having no one come in, and also knowing that like there aren't too many other streams of revenue yet for us, that feels like a failure. And so that was hard and acute, I would say, more so than in other contexts. Having that space and having that, a slow shop is a sad shop. And so, there was a lot of like working through that, I think. And also, having the confidence that like, or sort of understanding that a bad day doesn't mean a bad month, and it doesn't mean a bad year. And even a bad month doesn't mean a bad year. So that's those were some things we're working through now. Is like, we don't, it's hard. I think a helpful way of working as an entrepreneur, and when you're trying to build a business or whatever, is to have like a project mindset, right? So to be conscious of like set deadlines, hold yourself accountable, because you're not a team of 20, whatever. Hold your direct partners accountable, etc. Have timelines. Be conscious of like getting things done of their project, have steps, etc. Try not to inject too much process, but also be aware that like it's pretty easy to be free flowing constantly, but try to work in a project mindset. But what you come to realize is like, especially as an entrepreneur, projects just lead to other projects, and that's a good thing. It means that there's growth happening. But when you're a young company and you don't have much money, that can be very difficult, right? Because sometimes you just budget for one project and there's no budget left after that. And hopefully you're making money from, you're continuously making money. But I think that's been a challenge for us, is like, we put the budget behind and worked really hard to build an amazing website, but we still struggle to like really invest as much in driving traffic to it. And so it feels like we have this great product, but we're not quite in a position to be really strategic and invest a huge amount of resources in driving traffic to it and getting people to write about it and getting in optimizing SEO and getting consultants to look at it, et cetera, because we're strapped for time and we don't have tons of money right now. Or we don't, like any young company, you're not, or most, young startups, you're kind of breaking even or doing your best to break even. And so, I don't want to call that a failure because I think it's a function of running a business, and it also makes you probably hungrier, and I think it's a good pressure to feel, but it can be very, very frustrating that, you just feel like, well, I just did this project successfully, so why do I feel like we're stopped in the mud here? Aren't we supposed to be moving up the mountain? Or like, I started the car, why can't I press the pedal? And I think that there's times where that feels frustrating.
So how do you handle the frustration? Like, what keeps you going? How can you push past that when it comes up?
So I think the way I look at it is, there's a lot of times when you're trying to build something, I think from my experience, it's easy to like think of simplification as a real goal, like whether it's trying to finish a project or get a deal done or, make a change or whatever, you kind of try to like, there's this, you feel like a lot of people give you this advice and you also kind of manifest it yourself, this sense that like, okay, well, I just got to strip it down, just like be a fixer and, go through it and whatever, fucking simplify. I think in certain contexts that serves you really well. It might make you more efficient, etc. But I think actually when I am disappointed, when I feel like a sense of failure or I feel frustration, I think actually stepping back and kind of looking at the sum of all these parts and the sum of the whole experience and actually like broadening out of the company, right? Think about your broader life, etc. I think that can be helpful. Now, I don't know if that works for everyone, because I think sometimes that if you're deeply unhappy with where you are in life, sometimes broadening it out and really kind of putting it on a in a spotlight doesn't feel great. But let's say it works for a lot of people, I think, and especially entrepreneurs that are struggling and frustrated, and being able to just contextualize a little bit, right? Gain some perspective. So you might feel an acute failure. It might feel like, well, wow, we've invested so much time in this and it's just not going to work. I take comfort sometimes in like, oh, but look, I have this cafe that I can go to and spend 4 hours with a bunch of friends, basically. Like, that's super nice. Or I have this, to make it a little less personal, I have this website that I can like look at and be like, oh, this is a brand, and I wrote this copy, or I came up with this idea, and now it's like a thing. It's an item. Or just like step back and look at whatever product you have, like whether it's an app, whether it's something that's in progress, whatever. Like try to take a step back and really look at that as like an item. Like, this is a product you've created, or this is a service that you've spent time ideating around and really like shaped, and forget whether like, it doesn't matter if in this context that thing is failing or if you're not able to sell that thing right now or whatever. Like, step back and be like, wow, think about all the time that went into this. Like, think about all like I did this. And look at all these other people who never do that, never fucking create anything. Or, create it in a very controlled context where they're not the ones, really sort of forging it from nothing. And I think that that's helpful, because at the end of the day, I didn't, reinvent the wheel at all. I have like some little cafe and a little coffee brand. And I did it with a lot of help, it's kind of nice to just be like, whoa, this wouldn't exist if I didn't do the work that I did. Or, and I didn't help the people that I helped, or things like that. And so I think, kind of like, I don't know if there's a good way to encapsulate that, but just sort of like zoom out and just try to contextualize a bit, try to gain a bit of perspective. And like look at it as like, try not to dive into the minutia of the failure or that context that you're failing in, and like look at like, see the thing as more complex, right? Stop simplifying for a moment and actually look at the complexity and the broadness of this situation in your life and whatever project you're or whatever, endeavor or company or app or whatever you're working on building.
So basically appreciate your achievements and see the small things.
Yeah, and see that it's not just don't get tied down in don't build yourself, don't dig yourself a hole that you just fill with whatever this acute failure is, because it's in a month you're going to forget about it, right? Like if you're really developing something, if you're really building something, these failures should be something that you build on, right? It's not and you just have to step back and be like, well, what did I like? Even I think about it. I just got 3 rejection emails from B2B clients. And like, I was feeling really dejected. Just kind of like, wow, this seemed, why did I even spend the 3 hours writing those emails and doing that research or whatever? But then like something as simple as I went to lunch last week and this guy came up to me and was like, hey, you're the fucking Strong Coffee dude. Like, my friend is obsessed with your cafe. Like he loves your cafe. And it's like, that was awesome. I love doing that. You know what? You know how many other directions I could have taken my life in where that situation wouldn't have happened? And like, it's not going to, maybe that's not going to pay the bills at the end of the day or whatever. And maybe, that's not the only thing it's not the only gas you can drive your car on forever. But like, appreciate that also. That's a little win. And then I think that like those things exist all over. I'm trying to describe this in a less like just be positive way or just have perspective way, basically.
Yeah.
But in some ways, it's along the lines of that.
And do you have a last key takeaway for us that you would like to share with our listeners?
Actually, I'll say it in the context of the room we're sitting in now and the conversation that we've had. I do think like this, being an entrepreneur, trying to build something, build a company, make a space, etc. It's so not conducive to reflecting. And I think you might think that you have a lot of you might think that all you do is talk about this thing and talk about your experience with it. But I think that talking about it and actually reflecting on it and having reflective conversations is super distinct. Those two things are super distinct. And I think that, it's a real benefit to actually be able to reflect, to talk about insecurities. And it opens up. I think it's not just like some sort of like, oh, it makes me feel good inside. It's actually, I think it's really productive. I think like it makes you think about things differently. It makes you like actually unlock problems. And I think that it's probably, there's this idea that like, well, I don't have time to reflect. Like I'm going, I'm building this app. I'm, developing this software. I'm creating this business. I don't have time to like journal or write an email to my parents about this or whatever. But actually like that's where a lot of creativity I think comes. And I think that, reflection should be a tool in the toolbox of growing something, and being thoughtful and being critical. Like those are very relevant to running something and building something. And they shouldn't be just sort of things that are cherries on the top. Like they should be, really integral ingredients in the cake. So
I think that often also if you say certain things out loud, it already changes something inside of you and helps you.
I totally agree with you. Yeah.
And where can people find you online, or how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so we have a really lovely website called fuckingstrongcoffee.amsterdam. We ship all over the EU. We have 2 different editions, one from our cooperative in Rwanda and one from a really cool sustainable agriculture export project in Nicaragua. Both come in really fancy cans that are great gifts and support really good causes. So you can see us on our web shop, at Good Beans Coffee on Instagram. And more importantly, you can visit us in person at Good Beans just off the Haarlemmerstraat 7 days a week.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for your openness. And I really appreciate that you opened up about your insecurities. I think it's really cool. And for everyone who's watching or listening, you can always contact Cody if you want to talk to him. And if you're in Amsterdam, I highly recommend to get a fucking strong coffee.